Hello and welcome to another video review. This is the Lord of the Rings War in the North for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Mac. This is a hack and slash game with RPG elements that was released in November of 2011, although the Mac release was seen later on. And it was something that came out to fairly little fanfare. There really wasn't all that big of a storm surrounding this thing, whether it be good or bad. And there wasn't all that much hype around it either, apart from it being just considered a dark and gritty kind of Lord of the Rings game that we hadn't seen for some time. Because usually when you think of Lord of the Rings, you don't really think of dark and gritty, mature-rated kind of things. Well, they went for that with this one. So it was a change of pace from what we had been used to up to that point. But the real question here is, did they pull it off? Well, as far as the presentation goes, they've done a pretty decent job with what they've got. They've managed to keep the visual quality about what you would expect from a sort of AAA release. The texture work is pretty well done. It's nothing amazingly high-res or anything like that, but it works pretty well for what it is. The modeling is usually well done. The animations are generally smooth and fluid. And the environments have a fair amount of detail in them. Some of them are even outright beautiful. Depends on the situation with the lighting and everything like that. But they've done a pretty good job with the visuals for the most part. Then there's the sound design. Sound effects are rather wimpy in this game, actually. They work, but they're not impressive at all. The music is surprisingly forgettable. I mean, Lord of the Rings soundtracks were nowhere near forgettable. They were fantastic. And so you get to this, and it's fantasy music for the most part. It's okay. It works. But it's just generic fantasy music for the most part. At least that's what it feels like. So that ends up being a bit of a detriment, but nothing too serious. And then there's the voice acting, which, although they did a pretty decent job with what they've got, a lot of it still reeks of being a Tolkien-esque game. Obviously, it's based on the Tolkien mythos and everything. So there's going to be a lot of very dry dialogue that just leaves you going, really? You're playing this out? Seriously? So a lot of the dialogue actually ends up being very boring as a result, even though the actors are doing a pretty decent job with what they've got. So the voice acting ends up being more serviceable than anything else, although you will hear the same few lines over and over and over again. For instance, if you're playing as Eredon, who is the ranger, you're going to hear a lot of, "You face a ranger now!" and "You face a Dunedain now!" You're going to hear that a lot. I mean a lot. So, that does get very, very repetitive very, very quickly. And with most of the dialogue being as dry and boring as it is, it does wear on you after a while. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this revolves around 3 characters. You get to pick one of these to play. They are Eredon the Dunedain Ranger, Farron the Dwarven Champion, and Andriel the Elven Loremaster. Each of whom has their own sets of abilities and such. But the story revolves around them going off to fight this guy named Agandaur, and he's one of the commanders of Sauron's armies, particularly in the north. So you get War in the North. And so it basically revolves around what's going on in the northern regions while the Fellowship is doing their thing in the southern regions. So you do get to go to various locations that you didn't get to see in the movies or that were hinted at in the books and things like that. That sounds interesting, right? Well, there's a problem with that. The plot in this thing is extremely bland. It never really goes anywhere. It's just kind of a standard fantasy game plot. And by the end, it leaves you sitting there going, well, could have been worse. Could have been a lot better. Could have been actually interesting. But it could have been a lot worse. So the plot never really goes anywhere, and neither did the characters, actually. You do get to run into various characters from the movies and books, but they're more cameos than anything else, and more often than not, you're going to be very, very bored by the characters that you get to play as. They're just so flat, and they're just stock, basically. They behave like standard fantasy heroes, and not much else. Everything is just so bland in this game that you're just left going, oh geez, here we go again. People will launch off into their monologues. People will just sit there and say completely ridiculous things with a straight face like it's actually something dramatic and interesting. Admittedly, these are problems with Tolkien's writing in general, but at the same time, you gotta realize that stuff doesn't necessarily work in a game. It may work in a book where you got all this crazy fantasy lore going on and you're writing it in a very specific way, which does in fact make it interesting. But when you're doing a game, you need more spice, so to speak. And that never really happens in this thing. Everything just ends up being very bland, almost sterile. It's kind of a shame, really, because the plot never really goes anywhere, neither do the characters. And what few instances of role-playing are actually in this game don't pan out either. So that really doesn't help in the long run. So what about the gameplay? Does that save it? Not really. It is a co-op game. You can play with friends, but you might run into technical problems with that. I never really got a chance to actually play with anybody because very few people I know actually own this game. But at the same time, there were a lot of reports about technical problems with the multiplayer. I don't know if those have been resolved or not, but even if you're playing it with friends, you're still going to find it pretty bland and boring because of the way that the game actually plays out. It is one of the most average games I have ever played. I know that sounds like it's not really a detriment, but it is. The game never really does anything wrong, per se. The combat is generally smooth, it generally works. You have a variety of abilities available to you depending on what class you decide to play. Obviously, Eredon has different abilities than Andriel and Farron. All of them have their own sets of abilities. All of them can equip different types of gear. You can level them up over time as you gain experience. And the entire time you're playing, you just can't shake this feeling that it's just the same thing over and over and over again. Like I said, the combat's generally smooth. It's just that you're doing that non-stop. That's all the game really is whacking things in the face with the same few moves and the same few sentences being shouted in the middle of combat. I can't tell you how many times, again, that I've heard Eredon yell, "You face a ranger now!" Yes, we get it. You're a ranger. Okay. So what? But the gameplay itself consists mostly of just click mouse button until you get an icon that pops up over an enemy. Then you can hit the right mouse button, which is the more powerful attack, and that's going to finish them off with the sever moves. It's like, oh look, you chop their arm off, or you chop their head off, or something like that. It wears thin very, very quickly. The game ends up becoming a grind more than anything else. You're just going to go through the same areas. You're just going to go through these very linear corridors that are dressed up to make them not look quite as much like corridors. You're going to fight through hordes and hordes and hordes of the same old enemies over and over and over again. And eventually, you'll run into bosses that you'll have to fight. They don't really pose that much of a challenge either. There's occasional side quests which mostly involve you running into a certain item in the middle of going through the whole hack and slash thing. The combat never really gets interesting. It's just incredibly standard, the same repetitive left click over and over and over again until you get the icon, then right click and you finish them off. You do get those abilities, like I said, but they don't really do all that much to spice things up. You really don't get all that many abilities at all, actually. And so, it wears thin very quickly. But again, there's nothing particularly wrong with the game. It's competent at everything it does. But at the worst part of it is that it's only competent. it never does anything that is ultimately interesting, except for the setting, and it never really expands on the setting all that much. As far as the gameplay goes, you could do a lot better, you can do a lot worse. It works. What they were going for, they managed to nail it. It's just not very exciting at all. The gameplay, you can see it being more fun in co-op, but it's just not all that great. It's not all that bad either. It's just incredibly average. The story is incredibly bland and average. The characters are incredibly bland and average. And I know I keep saying that over and over again, but War in the North is one of the most average games I have ever played. And as a result, there's basically no reason to play it. It's completely forgettable. I actually had to look things up in order to remember them about this game, because I forget them basically as soon as I exit the game. It's mind-boggling. It's very rare that I've come across a game like this. Ultimately, I am giving this a 3 out of 5, but I'm giving you the warning. There's really no reason to play this thing. It's just so average that it ends up being boring. I mean, some people might like that, but there's so many better options out there. There's so many worse options out there. And admittedly, some of those worse options are actually funny. And so there's actually reasons to play them. This thing is just a time waster. Again, it doesn't really do anything badly, per se. It just doesn't do anything well, either. It played it so safe that it ended up being boring. It's a real shame. They could have gone somewhere with this. They just didn't. They played it safe. And ultimately, that ends up being a 3 out of 5 in the worst possible way. It is so average that it's boring. Thanks for watching.